My family thought I was invisible. My aunt sneered that lonely women invented fictional men to feel better about themselves. But every single smug grin in that room collapsed and crystal glasses tumbled from trembling fingers the moment 4 black armored vehicles rolled to a stop across the entire length of our private driveway. The man who stepped out into the cold Montana night was the most feared financial titan in America, and he was carrying a sealed legal portfolio thick enough to end my cousin's entire fabricated life. This is not a fairy tale. This is a calculated, meticulously engineered reckoning. And every person in that house was about to learn exactly what they had underestimated for the last decade. Hello everyone and welcome back to Whispers of Wisdom. We are so genuinely grateful that you are here with us today. Before we begin this story, we want to say from the bottom of our hearts that your continued presence and support means the world to every single member of our small but passionate team. If you find yourself moved by the stories we create, and if you want to help our writers and producers continue doing this work, please consider leaving a small contribution of just $1. You can find the donation link pinned in the comments below and also in the description of this video. Every single dollar goes directly toward keeping this channel alive and helping our team take care of their families. Thank you so much. Now let us get into today's story. My name is Renata Calloway and I am 36 years old. I want you to picture something very specific before I begin telling you what happened. I want you to picture a woman standing completely alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows of a rented Montana lodge, holding a glass of sparkling water she never asked for, wearing a plain charcoal wool cardigan that cost $42 from a clearance rack 3 winters ago. The mountains outside those windows are enormous and beautiful and completely indifferent to the drama unfolding inside. The room behind that woman is filled with approximately 30 people who share her last name, and not a single one of them has spoken a genuine word to her all evening. They have spoken about her. They have spoken around her. They have spoken past her as though she were a decorative lamp that someone had placed in an inconvenient location. But not to her. Never truly to her. That woman is me. The lodge our family had rented for our annual gathering sat at the edge of Flathead Lake in northwestern Montana. It was a monstrous, sprawling property with cathedral ceilings, exposed timber beams, and a stone fireplace large enough to stand inside. Someone in the family had apparently coordinated the booking months in advance, pooling together a staggering sum to secure it for 5 full days. I had not contributed to that pool. Nobody had asked me to contribute, which told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed my financial standing. The unspoken assumption was that I could not afford it. The louder unspoken assumption was that even if I could, my money was not the kind of money that belonged anywhere near theirs. The gathering was framed as a celebration. My grandmother Vera, who had passed away 14 months prior, had left behind a beautiful and valuable parcel of land in rural Tennessee. The family had decided to come together to discuss what to do with her legacy. That was the official reason printed on the group invitation that went out to every branch of the Calloway tree. But I had learned a very long time ago that nothing in this family was ever about what it was officially said to be about. This gathering was about one thing and one thing only. It was about status. It was about who had climbed the highest and who had fallen the furthest. It was a measuring contest dressed up in lodge fees and catered appetizers, and I had apparently already lost before I even walked through the door. The 2 people commanding the absolute center of the room that night were my cousin Brandon and my younger sister Sabrina. Allow me to describe them to you, because the picture matters. Brandon Calloway was 32 years old and had arrived that evening in a cream-colored luxury SUV he parked sideways in the driveway as though the property belonged to him personally. He wore a fitted navy blazer over a white designer shirt with the top 2 buttons casually undone, and around his wrist sat a watch that cost more than most people in this country earn in a full year. He moved through the lodge like a man who had paid for every square foot of it, clapping the older uncles on the back and refilling everyone's drinks with the confidence of someone who expects to be thanked for breathing. He was, as he had been every single year for the past 7 years, the undisputed golden son of the Calloway family. The story Brandon told about himself was spectacular. He had, according to the version he circulated at every family event, built an independent investment portfolio from a small inheritance into something approaching $10 million. He talked about markets with the casual fluency of someone who actually understood them, dropping terminology that made the older relatives nod with impressed confusion. He had bought a penthouse in Nashville. He had recently returned from a private sailing trip in Croatia. He was, in the eyes of everyone in that room, living proof that the Calloway blood produced winners. Sabrina, my younger sister, was 28 and had built her entire personality around a lifestyle brand she ran on social media. She photographed herself in beautiful locations, posted videos of herself arranging flowers and decorating rooms and trying new restaurants, and had accumulated a following large enough that she had recently signed with a talent management agency. She wore a silk wrap dress to the lodge that evening and had her hair in a style that looked effortless but had clearly taken no less than an hour to achieve. She had positioned herself directly beside Brandon for most of the evening, and the two of them together formed a kind of gravitational center that pulled the rest of the family helplessly into their orbit. I was the opposite of both of them, or so everyone believed. My mother, Patricia Calloway, had spent the better part of the past several years quietly apologizing for me at family events without ever using the word apology. She did it through small gestures. The way she changed the subject when someone asked about my work. The way she never mentioned my name when the conversation turned to accomplishments. The way she would look at me with a particular expression, soft and worried and faintly embarrassed, as though I were a problem she had not yet found the solution to. She loved me. I genuinely believe she loved me. But love and respect are not always the same thing, and my mother had struggled for a very long time to find something about me that she could point to with pride. She could not point to my job, because she thought my job was data management at a mid-size logistics firm. She could not point to my apartment, because she had visited exactly once and described it afterward to my aunt as modest. She could not point to a husband or children because there were none. Or at least none that anyone in this family knew about. She could not point to my clothes or my car or my social media following because all of those things were equally invisible. In her eyes, and in the eyes of every other Calloway relative gathered in that Montana lodge, I was the cautionary tale. The one who had not figured it out. The one who was still trying. The cruelest irony of my entire life is that I had figured it out. I had figured it out so completely and so thoroughly that almost nobody on earth was allowed to know. I am going to tell you the truth about who I am, but I am going to tell it to you the way it actually happened, slowly and in the right order, so that you feel the weight of every single revelation the same way it descended upon that room full of Calloways. 11 years ago, I graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with a degree in computational mathematics and a secondary concentration in network security architecture. I was not a brilliant student in the way that people romanticize brilliance. I was not effortless or naturally gifted in the ways that made professors take notice in the first week of class. I was relentless. I worked 18-hour days. I ran on black coffee and a genuine, almost frightening obsession with the elegance of systems and the vulnerabilities hidden within them. I understood, from a very young age, that every network, every financial structure, every digital ecosystem that human beings construct contains within it the seeds of its own compromise. Finding those seeds, mapping them, neutralizing them, that was what I was built to do. I spent my first 3 years after graduation working for a federal cybersecurity contractor based outside of Washington. The work was classified at levels I am still not permitted to discuss in any meaningful detail. What I can tell you is that during those 3 years, I developed skills that placed me in a category containing fewer than perhaps 200 people in the entire country. I could see patterns in data the way that certain musicians hear harmonics that other people simply cannot perceive. I could follow the ghost of a transaction through 47 jurisdictions and 17 shell companies and still find the single human hand that had initiated it. Eventually I was recruited by a private firm called Arcturus Analytical Solutions. Arcturus operated in the space between government intelligence and corporate security, providing investigative data analysis to clients whose problems were too sensitive, too complex, or too expensive to take through traditional legal channels. My title there was Principal Network Forensics Specialist. My actual job was to find the hidden money and trace it back to the hidden hands that had moved it. I was 31 years old and 18 months into my work at Arcturus when the morning came that changed everything. His name was Cassian Mercer. I want to be precise about how Cassian Mercer entered my life, because it is not the kind of story that lends itself to imprecision. He did not simply walk into our office. People of Cassian Mercer's standing do not simply walk into offices. What happened was that our director, a measured and unflappable woman named Dr. Elaine Fosberg, appeared in the doorway of our open-floor workspace at exactly 7:42 in the morning, looking in a way I had never seen her look before. She looked nervous. That single observation told me that whoever was coming was someone worth being nervous about. Cassian Mercer was at that time 40 years old and had built, through a combination of raw intellectual ferocity and an apparently total absence of sentimentality, one of the most formidable private capital management empires in the world. His firm, Meridian Capital Group, managed assets totaling somewhere in the range of $60 billion. He had been profiled in every major financial publication, had testified before Congress on 2 separate occasions regarding the integrity of digital asset markets, and was widely considered to be the most effective and the most dangerous mind in American private finance. He was also the subject of a level of corporate hatred so intense and sustained that several of his former rivals had reportedly required therapy. He came to Arcturus because $430 million had vanished from one of his primary managed funds over the course of 9 months, and his entire internal security division, which employed some of the finest technical minds in the private sector, had been unable to determine exactly how it had been done. He walked through our workspace with the energy of a man who has never once in his adult life waited for anyone or anything. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made specifically for his body, and he moved with the kind of physical economy that comes from absolute certainty about where you are going and what you intend to do when you arrive there. Dr. Fosberg was practically running to keep up with him. He dismissed her suggested analysts one by one as she walked him through the floor, barely glancing at the workstations, until he reached mine. I was the only person in the room not watching him. I was staring at 3 monitors simultaneously, working through a decomposition of a blockchain routing anomaly that had been bothering me for 11 days. I had my headphones around my neck, not on my ears. I was drinking cold coffee out of a thermos I had forgotten to close properly the night before. I was wearing a dark green pullover and had my hair in a clip I had been meaning to replace for approximately 4 months. He stopped behind my chair. I did not look up immediately. I finished the thought I was working through, made 3 keystrokes, and then turned around. He was looking at my screens. Not at me, at my screens. And the expression on his face was one I had never seen on anyone standing in that office before. It was not impatience. It was not the skeptical appraisal that most powerful men aim at women in technical spaces. It was focused. He was actually reading what I had been building on my screens, and he was understanding it. He pulled out a sealed encrypted drive from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed it on the edge of my desk without a word. Then he looked at me for the first time and said, "Tell me what you find." It took me 51 hours. I did not leave the office for the first 39 of them. I ate 2 sandwiches and drank more coffee than I can reasonably account for, and I sat inside his data like a surgeon with her hands inside a chest cavity, following every vessel until I found the one that had been quietly redirecting blood to somewhere it was never meant to go. The mechanism was extraordinary in its sophistication. Someone with intimate knowledge of Meridian Capital's internal authorization protocols had constructed a fractional skimming architecture across 42 separate transaction streams, each individual diversion small enough to fall below automated monitoring thresholds, collectively large enough to drain $430 million over 9 methodical months. The money had then been routed through a succession of legal entities registered in 4 different countries before arriving in a series of dormant trust accounts that had been reactivated approximately 2 years prior under names that bore no apparent connection to anyone at Meridian. When I traced those trust accounts, I found something unexpected. 2 of them were connected, through a chain of corporate registrations involving a real estate holding company in Delaware, to a name that appeared nowhere in Meridian's official personnel records. The name was familiar to me for reasons unrelated to finance. I presented my full findings to Cassian Mercer in a private meeting room at 6:15 in the morning on the 3rd day. Dr. Fosberg sat in the corner taking notes. I walked him through everything on a projected display, speaking for approximately 40 minutes without stopping, and when I finished, the room was completely silent for a long moment. Then he asked me one question. He said, "How certain are you?" I told him I was certain enough that I would put my name on it in a federal filing. He looked at me for a second time with that same quality of attention he had aimed at my screens on the first morning. And then something shifted in his expression. It was subtle. If you were not paying very close attention, you would have missed it entirely. But I was paying very close attention, because paying very close attention is the only mode in which I know how to operate. That was the beginning. I need to be honest with you about what followed, because it did not unfold the way that stories about powerful men and overlooked women usually unfold. There was no immediate sweep of romance. There was no grand gesture or cinematic moment of declaration. What there was, for the first several months, was a working relationship of uncommon intensity. Cassian retained me on an exclusive consulting basis for the duration of the criminal case that arose from my findings. We spoke on encrypted channels daily. We argued about methodology and strategy with a freedom that I later understood he extended to almost nobody in his professional life, because almost nobody could keep up with him well enough to make an argument worth having. The romance, when it came the way all real things come. Slowly, quietly, in the spaces between the work, in the silences during late flights on his private plane when the rest of the world was dark below us and neither of us could find a reason to stop talking. In the moment 4 months into our working relationship when he said something I disagreed with so fundamentally that I told him directly and without softening it that he was wrong, and he laughed. Not the performative laugh of a man pretending to be amused. An actual laugh, genuine and surprised and warm, and he said, "Nobody tells me that." I told him he should find better people. He said he thought he just had. We kept our relationship entirely private for reasons that were serious and practical. Cassian had enemies, powerful and patient enemies who had spent years looking for ways to reach him through the people he cared about. His corporate attorneys and his head of personal security both advised him with great force that any publicly known romantic partner would immediately become a target for intelligence gathering, manipulation, and potentially physical danger. I understood this completely. I had spent my entire career operating in environments where visibility equals vulnerability. The invisibility that my family interpreted as failure was, in the context of my actual life, a professional and personal survival strategy. So Cassian and I signed a mutual non-disclosure agreement prepared by his legal team, and we built something real and private and completely off the record. My family knew nothing. They saw a 36-year-old woman in a $42 cardigan and they drew every conclusion that cardigan invited them to draw. I want to come back now to the evening in the lodge, because what I have told you so far is the foundation beneath the floor of what happened, and you need to feel its solidity before I show you what it supported. The moment that broke the evening open started with an ice bucket. I was standing near the windows looking out at the lake when my mother appeared beside me. She had the particular energy she carries when she wants to ask something she already knows the answer to. She gestured vaguely toward the wet bar on the far side of the room where Brandon was holding court, and she said that Brandon needed more ice for his drinks and that I was not doing anything anyway and could I please run down to the small market at the bottom of the access road to pick some up. I turned to look at her. I want to be clear that I was not angry. I had moved through anger about this family a long time ago and come out the other side into something quieter and more purposeful. I was calm. I told her I could not go right now because I was waiting for my partner to arrive and needed to be available to let him in at the main gate. The room went silent. Not gradually. Immediately. One moment there was the ambient noise of 30 people carrying on multiple conversations, and the next moment there was nothing. The silence had a texture to it. It was thick with the particular disbelief that settles over a room when someone has said something that does not compute. And then Brandon laughed. His laugh was not the laugh of someone who finds something genuinely funny. It was the laugh of someone who has identified an opportunity to demonstrate their dominance in front of an audience. It started in his chest and spread outward and within 3 seconds had been joined by the laughter of his mother, my Aunt Gloria, and then by several other relatives who I will not bother naming because their individual identities matter less than the collective sound they made together. Aunt Gloria was the most theatrical in her response. She stepped away from the group she had been standing with, and she moved toward me with the slow, deliberate energy of someone who is enjoying herself enormously. She was wearing a dress I suspect cost more than my monthly rent, though of course she had no way of knowing that my monthly rent was not what she imagined it to be. She had a glass of wine in one hand and her other hand was touching the triple-strand pearl necklace at her throat as though it were a talisman. She looked at me with the expression that certain kinds of women perfect over decades of practice. It is the expression that manages to communicate pity and contempt simultaneously, and it is a very effective weapon because it forces the recipient to choose between defending herself and looking petty, or staying silent and looking defeated. She said that I did not need to make things up to get attention. She said that imaginary partners did not count as plus ones. She said it with a smile on her face that made the words land harder than a shout would have. Brandon seized on this the way a shark seizes on blood in water. He pulled out his phone and pointed it directly at my face. The recording light was on. He wanted an audience. He wanted footage. He asked me to describe my boyfriend for everyone. He asked whether he was a digital simulation. He asked whether he was a man I had met on the internet who sent me love letters in exchange for gift cards. He was performing. He was performing for the people in the room and for whatever audience he intended to share the footage with later, and every person in that lodge was either laughing or looking at me with a pity so exaggerated it was practically theatrical. My sister Sabrina had her phone up too, angled to capture my expression from a slightly different position. She had not said anything. She did not need to. Her silence and her camera were sufficient participation. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it matters. I felt nothing that they expected me to feel. There was no heat rising in my face. There was no tightening in my throat. There was no impulse to run or to cry or to produce some defense that they would immediately dismantle. I have spent my professional life in situations of extreme pressure and high stakes, and one of the things that years of that work teaches you is the difference between a situation that is actually dangerous and a situation that merely feels uncomfortable. This was not dangerous. It was not even close to dangerous. It was simply unpleasant, and unpleasant things, I have learned, pass. What I felt, if I am being entirely accurate, was something close to patience. The particular patience of someone who knows what is coming and is watching the clock with the quiet certainty of a person who has done all of the work and is simply waiting for the results to arrive. I looked at Brandon and his recording phone and I said nothing. I looked at my watch instead. I had approximately 4 minutes before my patience would be rewarded. But before those 4 minutes could pass, something happened that I had not anticipated. Something that revealed how truly desperate Brandon had become, and how far he was willing to go. I need to go back further again to explain it properly, and I promise you I will come back to the lodge before long. Several months before the Montana gathering, I was running a routine deep scan for Arcturus on a network of shell companies suspected of moving proceeds from a large-scale insurance fraud operation. The scan was automated in its initial phases, which means that while the software was doing its preliminary work, I was doing other things. I was eating a late lunch at my desk and reading a technical paper on anomalous transaction clustering when one of my automated flagging systems produced an alert that made me set down my fork. The alert was flagging a connection between one of the suspected shell company networks and a residential IP address. This happens sometimes in financial crime investigations. The criminals are often not as sophisticated as they believe themselves to be, and the digital threads they think they have cut still trail behind them. What made me sit up straight was not the connection itself. It was the address the IP resolved to. It was a Nashville penthouse registered to a company called Crestline Holdings LLC. I knew that name. I had heard it mentioned at a family dinner approximately 10 months prior when Brandon had been explaining, in extremely confident terms, how he structured his investment vehicle for maximum tax efficiency. My fingers were moving before I had consciously decided to pursue it. I routed around his consumer-grade firewall in under 6 minutes. The firewalls that amateur financial criminals construct are, from a technical standpoint, roughly equivalent to a screen door on a submarine. They feel like barriers until the water starts coming in. What I found inside Brandon Calloway's private financial records over the next 14 hours is something I need to describe carefully, because the specifics are important. Brandon was not wealthy. He was not even close to wealthy. His actual liquid assets at the time I accessed his records totaled approximately $87,000, spread across 3 accounts, 2 of which were in overdraft. The penthouse was mortgaged to within approximately 2% of its total appraised value, and the mortgage was currently 3 months in arrears. The luxury SUV was leased. The watch had been purchased on a financing plan from a secondary market dealer. The Croatia sailing trip had been largely funded by a personal loan from a private lender charging rates that would have made a payday loan operation blush. This was not the worst of it. The worst of it was buried in a set of documents I found in a folder labeled Administrative Records Tennessee, which is the kind of labeling that someone uses when they want something to look boring enough that nobody bothers to open it. Inside that folder were the forged signatures of 4 members of our family. My grandmother Vera, my grandfather Chester, who had passed 7 years ago, my great-aunt Lillian, and my own mother, Patricia. Those 4 signatures appeared on a set of legal documents that had been used to process a second mortgage on the Calloway ancestral land in Tennessee. That land, approximately 230 acres of farmland and timber property that my grandparents had spent their entire working lives paying for and preserving, had been used by Brandon as collateral for a series of increasingly reckless investment loans. Those loans had funded his lifestyle and his fraudulent performance as a financial genius, and virtually all of the money had been lost in a series of catastrophic cryptocurrency positions that Brandon had taken based on advice from a private Telegram group whose members had nicknames like Crypto Bull and Moonrocket. The ancestral land was not Brandon's to mortgage. He had no legal authority to use it as collateral. The signatures on the documents were not just unauthorized. They were fabricated. My grandmother had been deceased for several months by the time her signature appeared on 2 of the filings. Someone, presumably a notary willing to be paid for their cooperation and their silence, had processed the documentation without looking too closely at the dates or the identities. The full scope of what Brandon had done was this. He had stolen the retirement security of the Calloway elders. He had mortgaged the land that represented our grandparents' entire legacy and the planned financial foundation for our parents and their siblings in their old age. He had spent the money on a performance of wealth so convincing that the very people he was robbing were worshipping him for it at every family gathering. I sat with what I had found for approximately 40 minutes before I called Cassian. It was after 11 at night. He answered on the second ring because he always answered quickly when he saw my number. I told him I had found something personal and I needed to talk through it. He was quiet while I told him everything. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of reaction but rather the presence of very controlled reaction. When I finished, he said one sentence. He said, "Send me everything and give me 1 hour." 1 hour later he called back and he was not quiet anymore. He was controlled but he was not quiet, and the control in his voice was the specific variety that very powerful men deploy when they are containing something they very much want to release. He told me that what Brandon had done was a federal crime across multiple categories. He told me he could have 3 different teams working on it by morning. He told me that by the end of the week Brandon would not own so much as his own name. I told him to wait. I want to explain why I asked Cassian to wait, because it might seem counterintuitive and I want you to understand my reasoning completely. If Cassian had deployed his resources immediately, Brandon would have been quietly destroyed. The documents would have been confiscated, the assets frozen, the criminal referral filed through channels that would have moved with invisible efficiency. It would have been thorough and it would have been effective, and within a short time Brandon would have been facing federal charges. But the family would not have understood what had actually happened. They would have received the news of Brandon's arrest as though it were something that had been done to him, not something he had done to himself and to them. They would have grieved for him. They would have suspected, because people who have organized their entire emotional lives around a story of one person's superiority find it very difficult to release that story, that something corrupt had happened to their golden boy from the outside. They would have, within a reasonable amount of time, found a way to reframe his catastrophe as victimhood. I did not want that. I had spent the better part of a decade being dismissed and diminished by this family. I had watched them redirect their respect toward Brandon and away from me based on nothing more than a performance he had constructed out of fabricated numbers and borrowed money. I had listened to my own mother suggest, more than once, that I should consider giving Brandon my savings to invest, because he had a gift that should not go to waste. I wanted the truth to arrive in a form that could not be reframed. I wanted it to land in front of the entire family, simultaneously, in a context that left no room for revision or reinterpretation. I wanted them to see it happen. I wanted to be standing in the room when they understood what they had been doing and who they had been doing it to. Cassian listened to all of this. He was silent for a long moment when I finished. Then he said, "All right. We do it your way. But you need to let me put a monitoring protocol on his accounts and on his communications. If he moves to liquidate or transfer anything before your window closes, I need to know immediately." I agreed to that. A quiet, invisible surveillance layer went over everything Brandon touched digitally within the next 24 hours. We were watching him without his knowledge, the way I had spent my entire career watching people without their knowledge, and what we were watching for was the moment he realized he had been seen. That moment came 11 days before the Montana gathering. Brandon's own monitoring software, which was far more sophisticated than his firewalls but still laughably inadequate by professional standards, flagged an anomalous access event on one of his secondary accounts. He could not identify the source specifically, but the attempt had been routed through a proxy server cluster associated with Arcturus's registered network block. He did not know my name was connected to Arcturus. He knew the firm by reputation, as most people in financial circles did, and the reputation was sufficient to send him into a panic. He accelerated everything. The Montana gathering had originally been scheduled for later in the year. Brandon pushed it forward aggressively, offering to cover a larger share of the costs to smooth over the abruptness of the change. He began working the family in the days before the trip, making quiet calls and sending private messages that Cassian's team intercepted. He was building a narrative. He was telling anyone who would listen that I had been behaving erratically for months. He told my Aunt Gloria that I had developed a serious dependency on prescription stimulants that my job stress had driven me toward. He told my Uncle Ray that I was drowning in debt I had been hiding from the family. He told my own mother, in a voice message that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it, that he was genuinely worried about my mental state and that I had been exhibiting paranoid behavior and making increasingly strange accusations about people around me, and that if things escalated at the gathering, the family should not take anything I said too seriously because it was the symptom of a mind under severe strain. He was preemptively dismantling my credibility. He was building the scaffolding of a story in which I was the unstable one, the unreliable one, the one whose words and evidence and accusations could be safely dismissed because her mind was already compromised. He intended to use the gathering as the stage for a public declaration of my instability, to be witnessed by every family member simultaneously, so that when my evidence eventually surfaced, it would be filtered through the lens of my supposedly deteriorating mental health. It was, from a purely strategic standpoint, a competent plan. It would not have worked, but it was competent. What Brandon did not know was that Cassian's team had been monitoring not only his financial movements but his communication patterns, and that 11 days before the Montana gathering, something happened on his financial network that ended the patience we had been practicing. He initiated a liquidation sequence. He was trying to move what remained of the money he had taken, approximately $900,000 sitting in an offshore holding structure, to an untraceable account in a jurisdiction that does not cooperate with American law enforcement. He was preparing to run. Not physically. He intended to be at the Montana gathering, to perform his role as the concerned family patriarch worried about his unhinged cousin, because his presence there was essential to his narrative. But he intended to be financially gone by the time the gathering ended. He was going to drain the last of the stolen money, attend the lodge weekend, devastate my credibility in front of the family, and then disappear into a financial structure that would have made recovery of the funds nearly impossible. He also did something that crossed a line so fundamental that even my own careful patience cracked when I heard about it. He planted evidence. using access to a data exchange platform that Arcturus used for client file transfers, which he had apparently obtained through a contact at a competing firm. Brandon inserted spoofed transaction records designed to make it appear that the initial theft from the Calloway estate accounts had been initiated from a terminal registered to my professional credentials. He was trying to frame me. He was attempting to construct a digital paper trail that would have handed federal investigators a file pointing directly at me as the architect of a scheme to defraud my own family. Cassian called me when the alert came in. It was 2:15 in the morning and I was asleep for the first time in approximately 36 hours. I answered immediately because I recognize his specific encrypted channel alert, and I know that call only comes when something has happened that cannot wait. He told me everything with an economy of language that meant he had already moved. He was not calling to ask permission this time. He had already instructed his pilots. He was already in a car. His tactical security division, which maintained a rapid response team on the West Coast for exactly the kind of situations that arise when protecting the assets and people of a man with his level of corporate exposure, had already received their deployment orders. He was coming to Montana. Not tomorrow. Tonight, he said to me. You wanted to be in the room when it happened. I will get you there. But nothing else waits. I said I understood. I told him I would be ready. Back in the lodge, in the moment I have been circling back toward, Brandon had moved closer with his phone still recording. He was delivering what he intended to be the final scene of his performance. He had framed it as concern. He said, his voice tuned to the frequency of a man delivering difficult news with great personal reluctance, that the family knew I was going through a very hard time. He said they knew about the debt and they knew about the pills and that nobody in this room was judging me. They just wanted to help. He said he had spoken to a professional and had found a residential treatment program that specialized in exactly the kind of situation I was in, and that he was prepared to personally cover the first 3 months of my treatment if I would simply agree to go. He was offering to have me institutionalized. He was offering to have me locked inside a psychiatric facility based on lies he had personally fabricated and circulated, using money he had personally stolen from our own family, in order to prevent me from presenting evidence of his crimes to the people he had stolen from. My mother was holding a business card. The card apparently had the name and contact information of the treatment center printed on it. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were wet. She had believed him. She had completely and entirely believed him because she wanted to believe him, because the alternative required her to look at something she was not ready to see. I looked at that business card in my mother's hand and I felt, for just a moment, something that was not patience and was not calm. It moved through me like a cold current and then it passed. There would be time for that later. This was not the moment for it. I checked my watch. And then the sound came. It did not begin as something identifiable. It was too large and too sudden to process immediately as a specific source. What registered first was simply the absence of every other sound in the room, because the sound that was approaching was large enough to erase everything else. Then the vibration came through the floorboards. Then the headlights swept across the ceiling through the high windows. And then the screech of tires and the compression of heavy engines and the very specific crack of an iron security gate being pushed aside by a vehicle that did not intend to stop for it. 4 black armored vehicles, moving in a tight tactical formation. The headlights were a wall of white in the darkness outside the lodge windows. Every person in that room stopped moving simultaneously. It was the kind of stillness that precedes genuine fear. The few seconds when the body understands something the mind has not yet caught up to. The vehicles stopped. The doors opened with the synchronized timing of a unit that practices exactly this kind of entry. 16 men emerged into the Montana night. They were dressed in dark suits, not tactical gear, which somehow made them more unsettling rather than less. Men in tactical gear are a category the mind can file. Men in dark suits who move with the practiced physical economy of people who have neutralized real threats in real situations are something different entirely. They spread out across the property with quiet efficiency, and within 45 seconds the entirety of the Calloway family gathering was enclosed. And then the rear door of the center vehicle opened. Cassian Mercer stepped out. He had come directly from a meeting room in a Chicago financial tower, his flight landing at the Kalispell airport less than an hour prior, and he had not changed from his meeting attire. He wore a dark overcoat over a black turtleneck and dark trousers, and the coat was open at the chest because he had not bothered to close it against the mountain cold. He looked, as he always looks when he has set aside every consideration except the one directly in front of him, like someone who does not experience urgency the way ordinary people do. He looked absolute. His eyes found mine through the glass immediately. Through 30 feet of Montana night and the wall of glass that formed the lodge exterior, his gaze came directly to me without searching. He knew exactly where I was. He walked toward the entrance of the lodge. His team had the doors open before he reached them. I want to describe the way the room changed when he walked into it, because it was something I have not seen before and do not expect to see again. These were people who prided themselves on knowing the geography of wealth and status, on being able to locate anyone on the map of importance and respond accordingly. And when Cassie and Mercer walked into their rented Montana lodge, the recognition moved through them like an electric current through water. It was not gradual, it was simultaneous, the kind of recognition that comes not from a vague sense of familiarity but from a face that has appeared on magazine covers and Senate hearing broadcasts and the financial news segment that plays in airport terminals. It was the recognition that comes from knowing, with absolute certainty, that the person who has just entered the room is several levels of power beyond anything present in it. Aunt Gloria made a sound I can only describe as a choked gasp. Her wine glass tilted and she grabbed the stem just in time. Brandon went very still. Cassian walked through the center of the room without looking at a single one of them. Not from dismissal, or not only from dismissal, because I was on the far end of that room, and I was the only person there he had come for. He reached me. He stopped directly in front of me. And the expression that came over his face when he looked at me was the one I know, the one reserved for the space between us, and it is not a public expression. He keeps it carefully away from the world for reasons I have already explained to you. But in that moment, in that room, he did not keep it anywhere. He let it be completely visible and he did not care who saw it. He put his hands on my shoulders. He pulled me close. He pressed a long, quiet kiss to my temple and then he held me and looked down at me and said, in a voice calibrated exactly to carry across every corner of that silent room, that he was sorry for being late and that his team had needed to clear some things from the perimeter before he could come inside. Behind us, Sabrina dropped her phone. The screen cracked on the hardwood floor. Brandon had gone the color of old concrete. He was looking not at Cassian but at the lapel insignia worn by several members of the security team now stationed at the exits of the lodge. He knew that insignia. Every person in financial and corporate circles in this country knew that insignia. It was the mark of Meridian Capital Group's elite security division, and it was worn by men who protected assets worth more money than the entire Calloway family combined would ever see in a dozen lifetimes. He knew. In that moment, he knew. The thing he had been trying desperately to outrun for 11 days had just walked through the front door. Aunt Gloria found the remains of her voice. She was shaking visibly but she stepped forward because she is a woman who has spent so long being the most formidable person in any room she enters that she does not know what to do with the alternative. She said, in a voice that was trying to be imperious and landing somewhere closer to frightened, that she would like to know who exactly had given permission for this intrusion into a private family event and what was the meaning of it. Cassian did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Brandon. Then he reached inside his coat and removed a sealed legal portfolio. Not slim, not the kind of thing you carry 1 or 2 documents in. This was the kind of folder that means something. That communicates, through its sheer physical weight, that what is inside it has been built carefully and thoroughly over time. He placed it on the dining table. He did not slide it or push it. He placed it. It landed with a sound that cut through the silence of the room like a small thunderclap, and the force of the placement sent a crystal decanter rocking on its base and spilled a red arc of wine across the white linen in a spreading stain. He looked at the room. Then he spoke. He said that the man standing next to the fireplace wearing their family's borrowed confidence had forged the legal signatures of every elder in the room in order to place unauthorized secondary mortgages on the ancestral Calloway land. He said that every dollar of false profit Brandon had been boasting about for 7 years had been either invented or funded by money taken from their family's collective future. He said that Brandon Calloway had no personal wealth. He had a performance of wealth, built on theft. Brandon was shaking his head. He said it was lies. He said Cassian was making things up. His voice had gone high and thin, the voice of a man who has been very confident for a very long time, suddenly discovering what it feels like to be on the other side of certainty. Cassian continued as though he had not heard him. He said that the previous night Brandon had attempted to execute an unauthorized wire transfer to move what remained of the stolen funds into an untraceable offshore structure. He said that attempt had been intercepted and reversed. He said that Brandon had also attempted to implicate a member of his own family in the crime by planting fabricated forensic records designed to direct federal investigators toward her credentials. He turned and looked at me when he said the next thing. He said that the woman this family had spent the entire evening attempting to ridicule and institutionalize was the senior forensic network analyst who had personally identified and dismantled Brandon Calloway's criminal enterprise from the inside. He said that without her interception, every person in this room would have awakened the following morning to discover that their retirement security had been moved to an account on the other side of the world. He said that the woman they had tried to send to a psychiatric facility was the only reason they had any financial future remaining at all. The room was cathedral quiet. Then the footsteps came from the foyer. Two people in formal attire, carrying the kind of identification that does not need to be explained once it is produced, walked through the doors that Cassian's team held open. Their credentials carried federal authority. They walked past the assembled relatives without looking at them, crossed the room to where Brandon was standing against the fireplace, and they took hold of him. The sound of handcuffs in a silent room is very specific. It is not loud, but it carries in a way that softer sounds do not. It carried all the way to every corner of that lodge. The detective who led the arrest read the charges: wire fraud, forgery of legal instruments, unauthorized encumbrance of property, financial elder abuse, which is a federal enhancement that applies when victims include individuals above a certain age. Obstruction through fabrication of forensic evidence. The list was not short. Aunt Gloria collapsed onto her knees on the hardwood floor. It was not a graceful collapse. She was clutching her pearls and making a sound that was too loud and too raw to be called crying. It was grief of the specific variety that comes from having invested your entire identity in something that was never real. The family turned to look at me. All of them, one by one and then all at once. And the faces they were wearing now were not the faces from 30 minutes before. The condescension was completely gone. The theatrical pity was completely gone. What was there instead was something I do not have perfect words for. It was part horror and part shame and part the very specific disorientation of a person who has just discovered that the map they have been using to navigate by is entirely wrong. My mother was standing near the kitchen doorway. The business card from the psychiatric facility had fallen from her fingers and lay on the floor beside her shoe. The tears on her face were real. I am confident of that. She is not a skilled enough actress to manufacture what was happening in her expression. It was genuine shame, genuine devastation. She reached her hand toward me. She said my name. She said she had not known. She said they had not known. One of Cassian's team moved to intercept her before she could close the distance between us. Not aggressively, simply firmly, a wall of dark fabric that communicated clearly that the moment for approach had not yet arrived. I spoke to the room. I had been waiting to do this for a long time, and now that the moment had come, I found that I did not need very many words. The right ones were enough. I said that I had not protected the Calloway estate because I felt anything for the people standing in this room. I said that I had protected it because those 230 acres of Tennessee land represented the work of two people, my grandparents, who had sacrificed things I could not fully comprehend to build something they intended to last. I said I was not willing to allow that legacy to be destroyed by a coward and a thief. I said that protecting their grandparents' inheritance was the right thing to do regardless of whether their grandchildren deserved it. Then I said that from this point forward I did not consider myself to owe this family anything. Not an explanation, not a performance of normalcy at future gatherings, not the tolerance of cruelty offered under the banner of family love. Nothing. The room was still. Outside the windows the lake was black and enormous in the mountain dark. The fire in the stone fireplace was the only movement. Cassian put his arm around my waist. He turned us both toward the door. He said one final thing to the room, his voice carrying its full natural authority, which is something I have heard deployed in boardrooms and congressional hearing rooms, and it is always the same. He said that the next time they looked at someone quiet and overlooked and decided to see only what the surface showed them, they might want to think carefully about who was actually holding the door to everything they had. We walked out. The mountain air outside the lodge was clean and cold and very still. Cassian held the door of the center vehicle for me before walking around to the other side. When we were both inside and the doors had closed, the sounds of the lodge became completely inaudible. The convoy moved out through the damaged gate and down the mountain access road. The lodge's lights receded in the rear windows. Cassian reached across and took my hand. He did not say anything for a long time. He understood, as he almost always does, that some moments do not need words added to them. Some moments are complete as they are. After a while, somewhere between the mountain and the valley, I said that it was strange to feel so little. I had expected to feel something enormous. I had expected the vindication to be enormous and bright and overwhelming. Instead, what I felt was quiet. A very large quiet that had settled over the part of me that had spent years being small and invisible in that family. He said that was what the end of a long wait felt like. Not a celebration, just the absence of the thing that had been pressing down. I thought about that for a while. Then I said, the first thing I want to do when we get back to Chicago is sleep for 12 hours and eat something from a restaurant where nobody knows my name. He said he could arrange that. I said I know you can. You can arrange most things. He said not most things. Some things. The important ones. I looked out the window at the dark mountains and I thought about my grandmother Vera, who had known me in the way that some grandmothers do, with a quiet completeness that does not require achievement or display. She had known I was capable of things. She had never needed me to prove it to her because she was one of the few people in the family who looked at me without the lens of comparison, without the constant metric of how I stood against Brandon or Sabrina or the imaginary ideal that the Calloway family had constructed for itself. I think she would have liked Cassian. Not because of his wealth or his power. Because of the way he listens. Because of the specific quality of attention he pays to things and people he considers worth his attention. My grandmother was a woman who could recognize a real listener. She valued it above almost everything. I am telling you all of this not because the story ends with the convoy leaving the mountain. The legal process that followed was extensive and I will not walk you through every step of it because that is not the part of this story that carries the emotional weight I want you to leave with. What I will tell you is that Brandon faced prosecution across multiple federal jurisdictions. The mortgage scheme was fully unraveled. The forged documents were forensically authenticated as forgeries, which is a sentence that means the exact opposite of what it sounds like and simply means that the evidence of their falseness was conclusive. The ancestral land in Tennessee was secured against all pending claims and the fraudulent liens were dissolved. The family elders whose signatures had been forged received full legal remedy and the retirement security they had been unknowingly deprived of was restored. Aunt Gloria did not speak to me for several months. When she eventually attempted contact, through a mutual relative, the attempt was declined. She had spent too many years of Sunday dinners and family gatherings building a performance of contempt toward me while simultaneously positioning her son as my opposite and superior, and the distance she had created was not something I felt obligated to close. My mother came to Chicago 3 months after Montana. She came alone, without calling ahead of time, which told me she was doing something that required momentum and could not survive the deliberation of a scheduled visit. She stood in the lobby of my building and she called my phone from downstairs. When I came down, she was wearing a coat I had given her 2 Christmases ago that I had not seen her wear before and had assumed she did not like. We walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and we sat for 3 hours. I am not going to tell you that everything between my mother and me resolved itself in those 3 hours, because it did not and it could not. What I will tell you is that she said things that I believe were true. She said that she had been afraid of things she did not know how to name and had allowed that fear to express itself as comparison and correction and an endless low-grade pressure on me to be visible in ways she understood. She said she had not protected me from people who diminished me because she had been diminished herself for so long that she had stopped recognizing it as something one could refuse. She said she was sorry. She said it more than once and with the kind of specificity that distinguishes real apology from the performance of apology. I listened to all of it. I accepted what I could accept and held the rest in the space where it lived, not resolved but not unacknowledged. The sweater was a gray cashmere cardigan. I have kept it. It hangs in my closet in Chicago, and sometimes when I look at it I think about standing near those Montana windows watching Brandon perform his Golden Boy routine for an audience that had no idea they were watching a con. I think about how completely invisible I was to all of them, how thoroughly they had constructed a story about me made entirely of the things I lacked, and how not one of them ever thought to look at what was underneath the cardigan. You cannot see most of the powerful things in the world. That is not a flaw in the design. It is the point. Cassian and I are not secret anymore. The corporate merger he had been protecting was completed and the strategic landscape of his industry shifted sufficiently that the particular vulnerabilities his enemies had been looking to exploit were no longer viable. His security team assessed the situation and cleared the change in status. We appeared together at an event in New York in the spring, and a photograph ran in a financial publication under a caption that described me, correctly, as a principal forensic analyst with a background in federal and private sector cybersecurity. It was the first time my actual professional identity had been attached to my name in any public context. I looked at the photograph for a long time when I found it. I looked at the woman in it, wearing a midnight blue dress that cost significantly more than the gray cardigan, standing next to a man who looked at her the way that you look at someone you have chosen on purpose after a long and deliberate process of choosing. She looked like herself, not more herself than she had been in the cardigan. Exactly herself, just visible this time. That is the part of the story I want you to remember if you remember nothing else. Not the armored vehicles or the handcuffs or the wine spilling across the white tablecloth. The part one want you to carry is this. Being unseen is not the same as being small. The woman standing at those Montana windows, holding the $42 cardigan closed against the mountain cold, was not a lesser person than anyone in that room. She was not waiting to become someone. She already was someone. She had always already been someone. The room around her simply had not been paying attention. The rooms that fail to pay attention eventually learn why they should have. And the women they overlooked eventually stop needing them to. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this story. We put a great deal of care into every story we produce here at Whispers of Wisdom, and your presence and your attention means more to our team than we can fully express. We would love to know where you are joining us from today. Please leave your city or your state in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you or stayed with you, please consider supporting us with just $1 through the link in the description or the pinned comment. That support goes directly to the people who write and produce these stories so that they can continue doing this work. We will see you in the next one.